Welcome back to the Lore and Valor podcast. I am joined once again today by Mike Massa, and he has graced us with his luscious locks. He is not wearing a baseball hat this time. You are welcome, Joel. And we are back revisiting The Terminalist. We're on episode 2 this time. As the story progresses, the plot thickens, but we're opening up, and we're still not sure of Reese's reliability as a narrator, right? At this point. So, Mike, you were in a I'll keep watching, but have a fair bit of skepticism at the end of episode 1, I would say. Is that fair to say of your mental state going into episode 2?
It is. The first episode felt long. I recognized that it was doing a lot of scene setting. It had, frankly, the second largest amount of what I'll characterize as technical inaccuracies, but it told the story that it needed to. I thought Chris Pratt held up his end. Other characters and the actors behind them held up their ends. So I'm like, okay, I'll give it one more. And it was this episode, in particular, how it ended, that I'm like, okay, I'll stick with it. So it rewards the persistent and patient viewer, because then after this, it becomes a much faster paced story.
Yeah, I agree. So we ended last episode. He was, basically devastated, crying over the bodies of his wife and child in his home. And we pick up right where we left off. His friend Ben has made it to the house. And we go from there. We see NCIS and police putzing around in his house, collecting evidence, doing a bunch of things that I'm in no position to evaluate. And it's just in the background anyway. So I think the scene, I think it's fine to open up just cold where we were when we last left off, especially since
doesn't it after the intro, doesn't it actually start with the wedding of his wife and daughter? Because we meet his father-in-law, right? And it's a civilian wedding, and he's wearing a black suit. Isn't that where it starts?
The funeral.
And then he goes after the wedding in his suit and talking to Ben. He's sitting, they're all around the campfire, like doing the remembrance thing, and he leaves early. And he goes back to the house, and he parks himself in the kitchen, and he's just staring at the 2 bloodstains by the refrigerator and kitchen counter.
Yeah, Mike, that's actually the funeral that he's at.
Right. What did I say?
You said wedding. That's going to be the audio. This is the video commercial for this episode.
Yeah, I'm in a dark place about weddings and being married, aren't I? Wow.
Freud was right.
Yes, they leave the funeral.
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm. And they go from the funeral. His father-in-law says, "Yeah, I want to show you something. Come here. I got something for you."
Yeah. So to be clear, that's a common mistake. That's not actually his father-in-law. You do meet his father-in-law later. That's Marco, who is a Hispanic gentleman. It's maybe a little less easy to tell because he's gone fully gray. But Marco is his friend, who I don't want to get into too much now because he'll be much more important.
He's very convenient later. I thought that, and later, I'm not going to give anything away that's critical to the story, but his wife and daughter have a relationship with Marco's wife and daughter.
They do.
And that dialogue around another table, that's one of the things I like about it, is they make this show goes out of the way to show people in their home environments, albeit somewhat idealized, which I appreciated, whether it's a good guy or a bad guy. But okay, so the guy comes in and takes him away. They go to the campfire around the beach. They're all reminiscing and telling sea stories. Ben tells a crappy one. Reese leaves, and Reese goes back to the house, and he's just staring and staring and staring, which leads, I think, to the second most important moment in the episode, and one of the most important moments in the whole series, which is where he raises his line of vision from the bloodstains. And we discussed last time how they didn't really show the bodies in the way that the book did, or discussed it in detail because of the reasonable limitations on how much you want to show violence being done to his wife and daughter. But he sees his daughter's artwork that has the picture, the hand-drawn picture of mother, father, and daughter. And we had one of the folks watching the stream last time pointed out that the apparent age of the daughter seemed to be too old for what, like, the quality of artwork. You got kids, I've got kids. That girl looks like she's probably 7 or 8 to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
4, 5, or 6, and the artwork is at the level of a 4, 5, or 6-year-old.
Yeah. And I imagine that's the production not wanting to have to bring on a 3 or 4-year-old actress,
Yeah,
but
good point.
wanting to keep the thing. It's a correct observation. You're absolutely right. That my, like I look at
Yeah,
the girl.
we're picking the nits off and nits at this point, but that he flips it over, or
Mhm.
actually he folds up and takes it with him, and that piece of paper becomes the list
Yeah.
on which, if your name goes on it, you're not you're not making it off. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
he's crossing your name off one way or the other
Mhm.
in, using some ink or other available marking substance.
Mhm.
And so that was really important because, say what you want about Jack Carr, he knows how to torture a character and motivate them. And so all the way up to that point, that's what he's done. And now we have the beginnings of the list. And isn't that all? When he's looking at the bloodstains, he also has the first flashback to being with his family beforehand. And there's the bird that hits the window and leaves a mark on the glass, right? Doesn't that happen
Yes.
at that point?
Yes, that's
And
correct.
he names the breed of bird later, but not in this episode. Later on, he's recounting the thing he sees to, I think, to Ben, and he
Yeah.
says outright what, an ornithologist would tell us already, that the bird is a starling, and the nickname for starlings with some people are suicide starlings because they're forever flying into windows or dying
Mhm.
in groups, um,
Pretty but dumb.
doing things that are, lethally stupid
Yeah.
because they're not very bright as a group. And
Mhm.
uh, this the themes of loss and of suicide come a lot in this series.
Yeah. So we'd had
So,
a
I'm sorry,
version of
in this show.
Yeah, you're right. We'd had a version of this scene in episode 1, but it was much more abbreviated.
Mm,
And then we get a longer version where we see and hear Chris Pratt playing the guitar, and we see her doing the artwork, and then the startling hits. And then you get I want to highlight that, I'm putting a lampshade on it. The line of dialogue, "You don't have to lie to her,"
right.
when the daughter asks Reese, "Is the starling going to be okay?" And your impulse as a parent is to protect your child's emotions.
Oh
So you
yeah,
say,
it's
"Oh yeah,
fine.
fine. Don't worry about it.
Like,
Don't worry about
I,
it." There's
I imagine, like, the critical drinker from the famous YouTube going, "Oh, he'll be fine."
It'll be fine. um, but yeah, so that scene, and I love it's going to keep. There's probably a version every episode. I don't know, but there's a version of this scene that, like, you get not necessarily a different version, but yeah, no, it's fair to
No,
say
it's
a
definitely
different.
different.
Yeah.
It happens 2 or 3 times, and
Hmm.
what's more is other people, which is interesting because he blends sort of fantasy and reality.
Yeah.
Other people notice the mark in the glass. I think the journalist sees it at one point,
Yeah.
and I think
Yeah.
that's
And
the next episode because she's in his house for some
yeah.
reason.
Because it's very clear, like it's a theme very strong in these first 2 episodes that will play out somewhat throughout the series, is the unreliability of Reese's memory. And it starts to blend what seems to be a real memory blends with the hallucination fairly effectively and seamlessly to create not just psychological thriller, but bordering into psychological horror a little bit. Not like graphic, but like, when he comes in on himself in the suit holding the picture,
Mm.
that sort of thing. The playing with reality there works for me pretty well. um but then we're interrupted, his morning is interrupted by um the douchiest character we've met yet. NCIS agent Holder
Hey,
is back to
they
ask him some
they
questions.
got that perfectly right.
Yeah, and we continue in this series and escalate the tension in this series with Holder showing up. And I would say, um, he lets law enforcement into his house without a warrant.
Yeah. Oh,
Like,
you want to chat? Well, let's make an appointment. I'll come see you. No,
no
I don't
kidding.
consent to search.
Yeah. So he's very, very clearly hostile towards Holder, does not trust him, but is willing to let him into his home to poke around, and I'm like, I even a law enforcement officer I'm not naturally hostile towards, I'm not sure in Reese's situation I would want to talk to him without counsel.
Oh,
Uh,
100% not.
yeah.
100% not. So again, it's interesting. I know they do a number of things like that, and this is
Mm,
common in storytelling, where the most exaggerated example is the somewhat daft heroine making bad choices about chasing the cat out into the darkness during a horror film, right? You would never
yeah.
do that,
Yeah.
but you need the story to progress.
Yeah.
And at this point, I don't think that Reese understood that he was a suspect yet. And as much as he held NCIS in disdain, maybe those jerks can get off their ass, as he says, and actually do something about finding the killers.
Yeah.
So I can kind of squint and see it, but yeah, 100% agree.
Yeah. Well, and because like I'm not, neither crime thrillers nor like I don't write crime thrillers, and I've never really been involved other than in the military. I've been, involved with some court martials, but never a general. Usually, always a special. But special court martials are for minor shit, and general court martials are for we're going to send someone to Leavenworth or hang them potentially. We haven't hanged anyone in a while, but just for our viewers, like if you're wondering what the difference is between
Not
those.
not for lack of deserving candidates.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that should have been a divisional formation and a hanging, in my opinion. But well, that's in a whole nother can of worms.
Yep.
So even me with very limited legal experience would know, like, if my family's been murdered, the cops are gonna think it's me probably right off the bat, even though I would never hurt my wife and child. But that tends to be the trend in murders, is it's someone close. The
Yeah,
fact that
it's rare. It's relatively rare, statistically speaking,
Mhm.
for the murderer and the victim to not know each other,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's statistically rare, and also fair or not, like veterans have a reputation for mental instability. It's not fair actually because most of us came back more or less fine. Even if we were traumatized, we're still very stable. But the
There is a
depiction of us
reputation for that,
is
but it's undeserved when you
Mhm.
look at the crime stats and the proportion of veterans that commit crimes is, as I recall, smaller than the proportion of veterans that is in the population.
It's true. It is
So
true. Um,
we would rapidly, if this channel were ever to get monetized, this would rapidly get demonetized if we went into the details of what the stats actually say in the FBI criminal database that's available online. So I won't go there, but the data is
yeah,
there for those that care to go take a peek.
yeah. I
Shockingly, it
agree
doesn't match the majority of the media narrative. But
exactly.
so this guy, I think Reese is insufficiently suspicious.
Mhm.
We see douchey McDouchebag doing douchey NCIS things again.
Yeah.
You know, pretty much dropping broad hints that they don't trust Reese.
Mhm.
And Reese, in proper frogman form goes, if I was back in Iraq, I'd be yanking people's heads off by this point. The guy's like, yeah, well, you're not, which is
Yeah.
legit.
Yeah,
There's a
like this is
reason for following the rule of law. I'm a big fan of the rule of law,
me too.
uh, not least which because once you suspend it, even briefly, uh, you don't really get to say when it gets turned back on again. And a lot of bad things can happen. So, big
It's
fan of the
absolutely
rule of
true.
law. Reese is
Mhm.
still following the rule of law, but he
Mhm.
gets a sniff that maybe something's not quite right.
Mhm. Exactly. And I like that the Holder, while clearly douchey, at this point, I think it's still the reasonable viewer can look at it and be like, this might just be an NCIS agent doing his job. And you don't have
Yeah.
to like NCIS agents, but there's nothing inherently sinister about Holder at this point. I don't
No,
think.
no, he's just a douchey guy, right? And
Yeah.
and they give him the suit and the haircut and the rest of it. But I think that when that visit's over, isn't the next thing that happens is he gets back in contact, or she with him, with the journo? Doesn't that
Uh,
happen?
the next thing is actually, according to my notes, is the meeting with Pillar, Admiral Pillar.
Oh yeah, we go to Warcom, and I
Yeah.
think we already beat to death the reality of Warcom having an operational function. So I'm not
Yeah.
going to go back to that.
Yeah, they just the short version. They just squished multiple functions into an admiral who would only fulfill one of those functions.
Well, the
They
last
like,
time I was in the Warcom office was some time ago, after I
mhm.
got out, but some years ago, and it was just your basic business office with white drywall and industrial desks. It wasn't this, blue carpeted, oak paneled, dark room with a bunch of flags and whatnot. It was a very boring business office.
You'll never
Relatively
convince
speaking.
me you guys don't have the best of everything. No, yeah, you were sitting there in the
Has
admiral's
a,
office with
it has a really
30-year-old
good view. I'll give
scotch.
him that. It has a really good view. Best view in Warcom is from the Admiral's office for sure.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, I can believe they made the office look nicer because it just feels more dramatic,
Yeah,
and highlights the power and status which this man seems is perhaps abusing. I think
yeah,
by overblowing his office. Um, so beautiful funeral, weird opening to a conversation, and a good way to establish this guy's kind of douchey, without overstating it. Like the admiral just from day one, he's from the first minute you're talking to him, you can tell this is the kind of flag officer that guys like us hated when we were in. Like I think you any disagreement with that, Mike? I think they established that very well with his
no,
demeanor.
no, I don't disagree.
Mhm.
He bears a passing resemblance to a former, well, to a SEAL admiral who was Warcom at one point, um, who was very, very classically handsome, and I don't want to. I'm not going to name him out, but he's been called out for um, his reputation a few times in other books that you can find and read. Not hard to figure out who it is.
Yeah.
This just looked like a shorter version of him, right down to some of the schmarmy platitudes. There's
Hmm.
something about making '06, but definitely putting on flag or general rank, where there's a filter for people who are at least as effective and perhaps more effective at interpersonal communication and relationship management and marketing than, say, a field animal.
Yeah, I think that's undeniable across the military. I think that's just a truth
I've,
that
I've
you're going to run
only
into.
I've only known a few flag and general officers that didn't fall squarely in that category. And it wasn't that they weren't effective at communication, is that they had much better filters, but they seemed to hold on to a larger proportion of their original values than, oh,
Yeah,
what's the most important thing to a one-star admiral or brigadier general? Like, what's their number one thing? What do they want above all else?
the next star usually.
That's exactly right. They want to put another star on that flag.
Yep.
100%. No
Yeah, and
questions asked. Nothing. There's almost nothing worth that's not worth sacrificing. Whether it's a relationship, a promise, their honor, you name it. And there's
yeah.
very few that aren't like that.
Well,
Um,
it's to break in a little bit and get off on a little bit of a tangent. I
hmm,
love the movie Patton. Most of us do.
sure,
Uh,
but it was not written to be a positive biopic of Patton, right? That
but
movie was not intended that way.
but I'm not going to talk about Patton. What I'm going to talk about is the fact that Omar Bradley was credited as the chief technical advisor on that film, and he is depicted as a saint. Carl Malden depicts Omar Bradley as, oh, I'm just fighting this war because it needs to be fought, and I care about the American GI in a way you just don't, George. And it's like, fuck you, Omar. Like, I've read the history books. I know what kind of a commander you were. You weren't as sociopathic as MacArthur. I'll grant you that. But you relieved people to cover your own mistakes. You gave people no, like, in Hertigan Forest, you're relieving battalion, brigade, and division commanders without going to the front to see what's going on. Like, you were not some saintly, I care about the soldier above all else general, and it's bullshit that you're depicted as such. No one even good generals who still have some ethics, like the idea that they get there by accident is ludicrous. You do not get to be a general because you just accidentally got promoted up the ranks. I don't know how it happened.
I just stumble into it.
Yeah.
No, it's 100% agree. There are
Yeah.
Navy equivalents from World War II. Raymond Spruance springs to mind.
Yeah.
But yes, many examples.
Mhm.
And I'm not gonna follow the tangent, and I'll stay on course. But oh my gosh, I have
Mhm.
I have C stories upon C stories, and in part because I'm now 54 years old. The guys that I was were my year group, my commissioning date corresponds to people whom, if they're still in, are senior flag and general officers. So I
Mhm.
was there when they were a junior officer, and before that, the people that were my skippers and department heads, which in the Navy be the equivalent of, say, regimental commanders and so forth, have since retired, but would have been, the GWOT flag and general officers.
Yeah.
And watching some of their comments and decisions, I was just like, oh, dude, do you not remember? Was that not you driving the speedboat drunk, getting arrested by the harbor cops? Oh, I guess not. Yeah.
No, it couldn't be them. So the meeting, Admiral Pillar intentionally antagonizes Reese, but
Yeah.
in Pillar's defense, Reese not really his defense. Pillar's an asshole, but Reese does sound a little crazy. In this meeting, like you're not meant to like Pillar, but Reese has already been wrong about his timeline once. Has already admitted to being wrong about whether it was one of his SEALs or the local augmentee who set off the explosion in the tunnel system.
Yep.
So while it's very clear that Pillar is not a good dude from day one, it's also you're still not sure that Reese isn't just kind of crazy at this point.
Yeah. They do a credible job of
Mm-hmm.
establishing in the viewer for the viewer that there's reasonable doubt. Just
Mm-hmm.
because Douchey McDouche, the NCIS agent, and Admiral Provocative are being jackasses
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that they're wrong, right?
Yeah.
I have been the guy that has been the unsympathetic jackass who was right. So I recognize that role,
Mm-hmm.
and it goes a long way towards explaining the doubt that some of his eventual allies have about him at this point, whether it's um, uh, the well, we learn about the origin of their relationship later, but there's the person that's going to be his sort of personal bush pilot, which is very convenient, as well as Ben,
Yeah. Well, we've met
his
Liz at this point. We know her, but she
yeah,
hasn't started really operating with him yet.
yeah. No, it's a helpful scene. It sets up what comes next, and that's pretty much the end of the first half of the episode.
Yeah. There's only one technical thing I wanted to ask about that's rung very convenient, like that it was again serving what we want to happen rather than what organically would happen. And maybe it's not true, but he says he's been tracking Kahani for years, and I'm like, at least for us, we're tracking targets and engaging targets downrange while we're downrange. But if we're not downrange, that's a there might be a CIA case officer who's tracking someone for years. But I tend to feel like even operators, you're in theater, you're trying to get people, you're out of theater, you may still be knowledgeable about what's going on downrange, but you're no longer actively the person trying to hunt down the terrorist unless they're sending you to kill the terrorist. Like that's
Well,
kind of, like
yeah,
maybe I'm wrong about that.
no, you're right. You're right. If one makes a couple assumptions or presumptions in this case, um, let's pretend that Reese has been doing back to back to back deployments like a lot of people did during GWAT, and let's assume those deployments are all to more or less the same theater. At least they're reporting to the same. They're working under the same JSOTF, which is the Joint Special Operations Task Force. In this case, JSOTF AP for Arabian Peninsula. If they're going to the same JSOTF, um, they're going to have a consistent or persistent target list.
True.
So in theory, the intelligence officers that rotate in and out and the SEAL platoons that rotate in and out are going to see that list on every visit. And if the guy's name never changes, if he's always an HVT, high value target, then it kind of makes sense.
Okay.
But it's a valid thing to pick up on, because what's more likely is that he would do, if he's doing back-to-back deployments, they wouldn't always be to the same area. He'd change, especially if you're an officer, they might have you change teams, change theaters, go to a joint staff, pick a thing.
Yeah. And then the meeting ends dramatically when the admiral has the temerity to say, since you couldn't protect your men nor your family, which, good Lord, in the book, Reese breaks his nose. And counts on the fact that the admiral won't want to admit that one of his SEALs beat the shit out of him in his own office to keep him out of trouble, which in the book turns out to be true. Since I'm pretty sure I know who you're talking about with that particular flag officer who inspired this character. I leave it to your imagination whether that's likely true or not.
100% wouldn't happen that way.
Yeah, so it's a little even more convenient in the book than it is in the show, but it is emotionally satisfying when he does break his nose.
One of the things that flag and general officers are really good at is covering their ass.
Mm-hmm.
They're really, really good.
They wouldn't have gotten there if they weren't.
Myself, I don't think that a flag or general officer, especially from the SOCOM pool of flag and general officers, would say that. Because if you flip a guy over into condition red by referencing his recent loss in a manner that suggests or outright states he's culpable, he might kill you. Especially if he can get his hands on you. In the heat of the moment, it wouldn't take a whole lot of effort to pop someone in the throat and bust their trachea and then think about it for a while and decide if you're going to give him a cricotomy or not. Yeah. But I guarantee you that the flag and general officer would call security and there'd be he'd be in custody at that point.
Yeah. In the book, it's much more clear. It's even more clear that the admiral is intentionally provoking him in the book. I will say.
So let's put a pin in that and come back to it, because I'm not questioning that that's the author's intent, but I don't understand the character's motivation at that point to do that.
Yeah, well, and that would be spoilery, so we'll talk more about that later. So
pin it.
Yep, pin that one. So yeah, we return to Katie doing reporter shit at this point, and she shows up at the clinic maybe, but she's talking to Holder, is the bottom line. And I like this scene because, again, Katie Burnick from the book is very much Reese's cheerleader, like the whole time, and very easy to like her, but also a pretty flat character in a sense, because she's just there to help Reese, and she helps Reese, and she's not terribly conflicted about it in the first book. In this one, Katie is doing her own thing, trying to be a reporter, and does something pretty shitty. Offers Holder the information that Reese waved a gun in her face in order to get access to his knowledge of the case, which is like, oh, you shit. That's kind of awful, but adds depth to her character, makes clear her motivations. And I especially like this one because Holder actually appears kind of reasonable when he's talking to Katie about the investigation. Like we've talked about the unrealism of Reese being insufficiently suspicious and Holder's procedure being off, and this is not really the way it would happen. But if you accept all that on the story's terms, when Holder's talking about his investigation of Reese, he seems much more reasonable than you would expect. If he's as big of a douche as Reese thinks he is, because he's like, yeah, no, I haven't arrested him because the evidence doesn't point to his arrest necessarily. So it looks like he's trying to do his due diligence as an investigator at that point.
The screenwriters are doing a good job of keeping the viewer unsure all the way up to the end of the episode. 100% agree.
Yeah. And then Katie goes, we have another scene with Katie and Reese, right? And we get a lesson in basic paranoia. Don't bring your smartphone to anything that might interest the alphabet soup agencies. That sort of thing. So you have Reese and Katie talking, and Katie points out what I just said, that Holder doesn't seem to be out to get him. And she does manage to convince him to cooperate, at least to some extent, with her investigation in exchange for information that she has. And it's a good, effective scene. I like it. One thing at this point, though, is he keeps talking about Kahani. And correct me, at this point, we're we've gone through the funeral, some fallout at the house, Holder's investigation, meeting with the admiral. He's keeping up the Kahani idea longer than I think most of the audience thinks Kahani is a thing. Like he keeps talking about this guy from downrange. At this point in the story, now admittedly, I've read the book, so I know that Kahani wasn't even a thing in the book. The target of the raid in the book isn't really that big of a factor in the rest of the story. It's just that they got set up on the raid.
Yeah,
But
but it's we're continuing to establish, or at least providing ammunition to the viewer, that he's an unreliable narrator, right?
yeah,
He's fixated on, he wants someone to blame. Who's he?
exactly.
Where did his losses start?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's unrealistic that a person that's gone through that amount of physical and emotional trauma is not tracking 100%.
Yeah,
And
and
we'll
that
find out later. There's even more reason for him not to be tracking properly, right?
mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, absolutely.
yes, you bring up a good point, a valid one. I think in the larger scheme, it can be among the categories of things to be hand waved away. This one's like, very low. It's down here and it's not up here.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's kind of what I was getting at, that like Reese is clearly not, and furthermore, that Reese is hesitating to pin this conspiracy on an American source, right? That he's still not trying to believe that even an asshole like Pillar or Holder is actually the root of the problem. So one thing that we immediately go into him starting research after this, and I assume Reese must have a really good VPN since he starts immediately stalking the NCIS agent that he thinks is bent. And we get this scene, this very dramatic scene that he looks at Holder's eyes, then he flashes back to his fight in the MRI room, and we get the bit of evidence that Holder may have been actually involved with the attack.
Although as you know, it's hard to recognize someone just from this, from this much, right? So
Yeah,
I think we're still, there's still doubt.
yeah,
It's enough for him, and you know,
and
his
it turns out
buddy
to be wrong
Ben,
though.
who's very reasonable, and is yet very much, he's reasonably skeptical, but he's very much Reese's ally. He's like, all right, man. I mean, it's got to be this way. It's got to be this way.
Yeah,
And I
well,
actually like the Ben character with all the artificialities still quite a bit.
me too. I like Ben, and Ben is improved from the book in many ways that
Okay.
we won't go into till we get towards the end of it. Ben is improved in many ways. I like when he busts into Ben's house. Just again, from my experience, the difference between the two men in terms of even though Reese's prior service, Reese is a little more clean cut. He's not covered in tats. He's not sleeping on his couch. Like it is like a little bit of like no, like the troops and the officers, there is a slight difference, and they really kind of, and even Carr has brought this up when he's talked about it. They have been tatted up for a reason. To bring that home, that like he's one of the troops and Reese is one of the officers. They're close, they're friends, but they didn't live exactly the same life.
Isn't
Um,
Reese's prior enlisted, isn't he?
Reese's prior service.
Yeah.
Reese, like the author, went to college before going to the SEALs, enlisted first, and then commissioned.
Yeah.
He already had his degree. So anyway, we have, like you said, been supportive if skeptical. He criticizes Reese's tradecraft in getting close enough to get that good of a photo of Holder.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the apartment recon, which at this point, if Reese is interested in anonymity, he's showing his face around what he intends to be the scene of a crime. So I don't know how else you would do that, but it seems like he's committing pretty hard at this
I
point
don't.
to.
Do we want to give away any part of the end of the episode? Because I don't think that Reese planned that end that way. He was strictly doing surveillance, and he's got who else can he trust to do this, right?
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And Ben would be as bad as him because they're known associates. So it's not like
Arguably
he's got a
worse.
third.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not like he's got a third party to send. So we get the apartment recon. I like. We then burst to another Katie being a journalist scene, and I like this again. You have card shark Katie messing with 20 somethings at the table. And it's kind of a throwaway scene, but it establishes that Katie is maybe a little irresponsible and, maybe her ethics are somewhat flexible. But I do
And
like
also that she's capable of deception.
yeah, absolutely. And I like that the meeting with her boss. I also like the little character beat that she goes all in on that hand because she knows her cover's about to be blown. That she's trying to play this neophyte at poker, and her boss shows up and is giving her away. She's like, "Oh crap! Let me see if I can, let me
Right.
see if I can take it all with this hand." Um, I like, even though none of this was really in the book, to my memory, it establishes her own motivations, her own pressures, and her own ticking clock. Right, that she's got a career to worry about, and she's got a boss who wants a story, and it makes her more fully rounded than it ever did in the book, in my opinion. I know you haven't read the book, but I think the
I
scene serves
haven't.
that
I
function.
do like the Journo character in terms of how she's written.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't like journalists as a rule. Go
Me neither.
figure. But there are journalists and there are journalists, and if you can find one that at least will tell the truth, and at this point she has no reason to be loyal to Reese, right? He's a
Yeah,
story. She's made him no promises,
yeah,
not a one,
yeah.
and she will continue to do things that are, um, if not manipulative, then deceptive, which is why I used
Mm.
the term earlier about the poker game. She'll
Yeah.
bluff, she'll lie, you know, she has an agenda. And that's
Mhm.
from a character perspective, that's actually really helpful.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Not having read the book, I was wondering if she was going to end up on the list at some point.
Mm. There's definitely, throughout the series, there's definitely hints in that direction where there are none in the book.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, like I said, I like that scene for setting up what's driving Katie and how it's driving her sometimes parallel to Reese and sometimes at odds with Reese. And I
Hmm.
do like that. So we get to another scene where I'm going to defer to you. So the break in at Holder's house, we get back to him coming back to the same apartment and breaking in. I noticed they said, "Oh, we don't need a security system." I'm imagining they just issued the security system in the show both for time to make it simpler to break in, and because it's probably not great if they show how to authentically, you know, circumvent on the market security systems. Probably something they probably didn't want to do. But how did you like the break in and reconnaissance scene? I didn't see anything terribly stupid off the top of my head.
One of the things
Um,
that they got right that you rarely see in other kinds of cop shows or PI shows or adventure shows is pre-mission rehearsal, right? You rarely see that.
mhm,
And he, during his recon, snaps a picture of the lock, of the specific lock on the specific unit, I might add,
mhm,
and then he goes and buys one and he practices picking the lock to get
mhm,
his feel just right for the spring tension on the tumblers of that particular make and model, which is 100% legit what you would do. A good friend of mine, now deceased, um, as a civilian, he had a military career I won't get into, but as a civilian, he worked for a very well known, very high profile brand that does cyber physical security assessments. And he physically broke into a large, again, a very big branded name film distributor because he'd been hired to assess their security. And when he gave them the report, they said, "Oh no, this, yes, we appreciate your information, and yes, you worked very hard, pat pat, but you could never actually do that because he had skipped certain steps which are illegal, which he would be criminally liable for if he actually did them, and just
mm,
said, I can do that A, B, C, and D, and therefore your secure facility is not secure." I said, "Oh, you can't." And he got really mad, and his boss goes, hold on. Thanks for the feedback. I will talk to my colleague, and we'll meet tomorrow. And if we can't convince you by tomorrow that our report is worth it, then you get it for free."
hmm,
And the boss took him out and said, "Can you do it legit?" And My friend Kevin's like 100%. And boss said, all right, don't get caught. And the next morning, during a follow-up meeting, back in nice clothes, he slid 4 Gold Disc Masters of their next 4 movies to the program distributor and said, your security sucks and here's why. And one of the things he had to do, he did a number of things that included electronic security, but on the physical security side, he had the make and model of the lock, and he is an accomplished lockpick, and he practiced for about 30 minutes so he knew he could do it in 2 or 3 seconds if he had to, and he did, and they got that right. So, and they actually show him properly putting in the tension bar. The magic is the tension bar and then feeling for the tumblers before you rotate, because when you rotate, they can slip again. It's I don't have a good touch. Kevin was really good.
Nice.
And they got that part right, which I really appreciated. That they only show one element of how to do it was sufficient, because it was the nod to those that know.
Yeah. It implies the knowledge and the expertise and the care to do everything else right. And he has he uses a smart device for the edge alignment on the computer too, and taking care to try to put things genuinely back, not just an approximation of what they were when he
was gloved, properly gloved.
Before he broke in, which is good. So then we transition from there into the Secretary of Defense showing up again, because she's apparently taken a personal interest in Reese. There was none of this personal interaction in the book. They really wanted to sell that the Secretary of Defense has a human concern in Reese, and so she plays mommy. But I like about her dialogue that it feels appropriately awkward. She feels like a politician trying to relate to a real person to me. And I think that's actually good writing. It seems stilted, but it's properly stilted. Of
Well,
a cabinet.
Sorry, this is in the bar, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And doesn't she tell him when he insists that it's Kahani, she says, no, it's not, and here's why.
Yep, exactly. Because she had told him in episode 1, when he's dead, you'll be the first to know. So she was made sure to be sitting with him when it hit the news.
So there are 2 well-known and a couple lesser known, what I'll call seal bars in Coronado. The best known, of course, is McPee's. Arguably the best known after those 2, or after McPee's, is Danny's Palm Bar and Grill on Orange Avenue, and they did a good job of mocking up a later bar. But this one looks a lot like the Brigantine, also on Orange Avenue, with the wood paneling and the wood bar. So I don't know if that was a deliberate nod or if they filmed it on site, but it looked like that could have actually been the Brigantine.
Cool. That's a good detail.
And they actually do have, news running and team guys in there wearing polo shirts that were bought at Baby Gap. Actually, the guys go in there dressed like shit, flip-flops, cargo shorts, and tank tops. So, so I'm at the end of our episode review, I want to go back and put another pin in this conversation, because her character is highly consequential in the story, and I question the intelligence of the character as written if she's getting this close to Reese now. It does not make sense to me. I'm like, if I was in her position, feeling the way I do, with the exposure that I have, would I actually do this? And all I can come up with was she's trying to reassure him that he's wrong and he needs to get on with his life, because she also has other knowledge, which
I think
I don't want to spoil it, but I can kind of see it from that angle. But otherwise, it just doesn't make sense. Now, it moves the story along, but this one kind of rages into the sort of, instead of being down here, this one's sort of in the middle, hand waving going on.
Yeah,
but it moves the story along. I found myself vaguely sympathetic to her character. If you accept the premise that SecDef is going to take a personal interest in this particular case, okay, great. She wants to come deliver the good news that she can't otherwise tell him that, hey, we got the asshole. Put your mind at rest. Kahani's dead. Mourn you're dead, and get on with your life. Okay, I can kind of see that ish.
Perhaps. I agree with you. I also think the writing decision is while it certainly doesn't ruin the episode or the show, it's a highly marginal decision. Works, but only I stop to think about it, and that's not what you're trying to do as a writer. You're trying to keep immersion, and that's another one that even as a again, not as someone with expertise on matters military or national security, just as a logic thing of that character, I don't know that seems terribly reasonable.
It,
Um,
I think it's the difference between TV and writing.
mhm.
If I wanted to make sure that her character remained in the mid ground with my reader, I would write a short scene from her point of view where she's calling someone to check on Reese's status and make sure he's getting everything that he needs and make sure he's aware, it wasn't Kahani, even if it was, he's dead now. Make sure he's aware, and that'd be that. But they really can't head hop like that as much. I think that in this in this series, there's really only 2 points of view. There's Reese's and the journo, and that's
You
pretty
do
much
get
it, right?
you do get one or two scenes from the Sec Def's point of view. You do get scenes from her point of view, and you get scenes occasionally from Saul Agnan's point of view, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And you
Yeah,
get a
yeah, yeah, yeah,
scene,
yeah.
and you get a scene or two from Horn's point of view. And then there's an FBI character later on that also becomes a point of view character, but we'll get to
Yeah, you're
him.
right. You're right. You're
Yeah,
right.
we'll
Those
we'll
are
get to him later
those are
on.
appropriate and good corrections. But that's how I
Hmm.
would have handled it versus having her talk to the character in person. But I get why
Hmm.
they did it. It's an excuse to be in Coronado and go to Brigantines and have a shoot and have a beer. Sure, why not?
Yeah. So uh, Kahani's dead, and that cements in the mind of both Reese and the viewer that Kahani's not the big bad, if there is one, if Reese isn't just crazy.
Yeah.
Um,
And so at that point,
so
I remember thinking at that point, having watching it fresh, I'm like, well, shit. I guess that's that.
yeah, yeah. Um, but then Ben, good old reliable Ben, pulls the fact that Holder pulled Reese's biometrics long before he could have reasonably been a suspect in any murder.
And they're only
Uh,
available one place.
yeah, and that Ben is then in all in super fast, which isn't necessarily in conflict with his character because he's obviously wrecked by his friend's wife and kid dying. It's clear he was very close to the family, and even though his story at the beach, well, let's face it, you and I have both told better stories on panels together. Like if you're going to tell a no shit story about somebody, you probably come up with a better one. But I get it. You only have so much time to write. They couldn't come up with something better in time, so they shot that, and it wasn't terrible. It was just meh. Um, so Ben's in super fast, and we are on to War Pigs. You have some Aussie in the track, and shit's about to get serious. Meanwhile, Katie bribes the clinic for Reese's medical reports, uh,
Which
even more
at that point,
solidifying her
she's
questionable
ticking downwards
ethics.
in my esteem.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Uh,
ugh.
so then we have the climax of the story. Reese is breaking in to confront Holder, and they hand Reese a Kimber 1911, which was Boozer's, and this is the weapon that Boozer would have allegedly shot himself with. Now, I want to be clear about my credentials in this. I am not Larry Correa. I was never a Navy SEAL, but there are better 1911s than a Kimber.
Oh my
I'm
God.
yeah.
I'd be yeah, no.
So I don't know why they picked a Kimber. I mean, it is possible that a competent shooter just has an affection for a suboptimal weapon. That's possible, but it just seems like you've got STIs, you've got Wilson Combats, even SIG makes a better 1911 than Kimber.
There is a case to be made that an operator might like an impractical weapon, but not a suboptimal weapon.
Fair enough.
Suboptimal means it may not go bang when it's supposed to go bang, and above
Which,
all other qualities, the
yeah,
number one thing
which Kimbers are guilty of. Like
is a
Kimbers have
gun
more
has to go
malfunctions.
bang when you want it to go bang. And
Mm,
your audience can go do a web search on Kimber model 1911 reliability and perform their own assessment on whether or not that brand is known for that quality. Spoiler, nope. quite the reverse. So there's lots of things. You know what would have been a really good one they could have done? They could have made Boomer have been
Boozer.
a competitive shooter and have one high new shooter at the Pack Fleet pistol matches. And when you do that, if you're the high new shooter, they give you a gun. They give you a handgun, or at least they used to. And it could have been just, and what it is an old FUD, Re-Arsenal 1911 that they give away, right? And he could have done things like he could have slicked it up and sent it off to Wilson and, all kind of fancy parts and have a black Raven on it and fancy grips and blah, blah. They could have had fun with that. Anything but a Kimber.
I'd use a Rock Island Armory confidently before I'd use a Kimber personally, if I was actually doing.
Hell, if I had to pick a generic 1911 to build from, I wouldn't get a Springfield. I think I'd probably get a Colt. I'd get an old, remember the model, instead of 1911, they had something called a model 1991 for a while.
Yep.
But it's a legitimate Colt.
And
then I
built an actual Colt production, not a licensed. Yeah.
Assuming that I didn't just send it to some Smith and have him basically make a whole new gun from scratch with a hand milled slide, I just take the existing gun and I get a bunch of Wilson combat parts, and then I fiddle with it to get it to where it was reliable.
Yeah.
But that said, so he has this Kimber, and he's interrogating Douchey McDouchebag, who at first is like, "No, man, I'm not the guy. You're out of your head. Man, calm down. I'll help you. You're not, we're not enemies." And I'm like, this is going badly.
Yeah, and all Reese has got is, even though some of the stuff is very suspicious, it's still all circumstantial. There's no hard smoking gun that says Holder is bent. He's just a dick.
So what does Reese do that flips the switch?
So we're in the moment, right? And he's pushing him. He starts having hallucinations and headaches in the middle of it, which is rough because he's back in sector and apparently performing a tactical questioning, because we're not interrogators, so we don't interrogate detainees. We tactically question them. And it's flipping back and forth. Yeah. It's flipping back and forth between him and Boozer with a detainee and back in the bedroom, and he's flipping out. Holder knows he's flipping out, knows there's a very big risk he will die. And Holder's seems like he almost has him convinced it's in his head, but then he realizes, if I'm wrong, like, I could believe you that I'm wrong about what happened downrange. I'm wrong about Boozer, maybe.
Okay.
But if I'm fully wrong, then I killed my wife and kids, and that did not happen. I will never believe that. And that's when he presses, and that's where Holder breaks. And I like that. I think that was good. I think that was dramatic and satisfying and good for me.
It was. What made it credible was that Holder recognizes that Reese isn't altogether present and correct. And that would be really scary. If the person you're up against isn't a rational thinking person, you can no longer predict the output to your input, right?
Yeah.
And if you want to
game theory falls apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the actor did a really good job of crumbling. I mean, it's at this point for the audience, you have to know. So Holder is tied up. If I recall, Reese is basically in a full mount on top of him, right? With the gun up in his face.
He's got him zip tied, and he's either full mount or standing just to the side of him with a suppressed Kimber in his face.
That was one of my issues. Zip ties are crappy restraints, and he was using single nylon generic zip ties, not that strong. The proper zip ties for prisoner handling are actually wire reinforced. They're much thicker, and they come as a prepackaged unit. Or you just take them, shove the hands in one pool, and they're done.
Yep.
So
we were issued the same thing.
Even if you field improvise your flex cuffs, you still double them up, and there's tape involved, and Reese's character would have known that. So that was kind of a
Well, and in the brief fight, Holder I don't think he even breaks them. He just hits Reese with something, grabbing it with both hands, because the other mistake is he's not zip tied behind his back, right? He's zip tied in front. But that's again, listening to the podcast on the production, there was initially an elaborate struggle over the gun, hand-to-hand fight, and it just wasn't working. So it became he He tries to hit Reese. Reese shoots him in the head, and we're done. And that's
Yeah.
Reese's first kill, which I liked. I thought that was that part was nice too. So bang done. He gets one name out of Holder. He gets the next name for the list, Saul Agnon, who is one of my favorite slimy bad guys in this show. I freaking loved it. I love that character, and I'll talk about that more when we get to the next episode. Reese walks away, stops under the flag, realizes he's no longer operating under any semblance of color of authority, and he's now an outlaw and a murderer.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And they symbolize that very effectively as he exfiltrates from the apartment and goes down the narrow, dark passageway towards the shadowed ocean into the darkness, right? He is now off the res in every way.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
at the same time, he knows he's not fucking crazy. He knows his family was murdered. He knows his platoon was murdered, and he knows he's not going to be believed. So he's just going to keep pulling on that thread.
Yeah, and to be honest, while I would do so nowhere near as ably as James Reese, or perhaps you in his situation, I might do the same thing. I might attempt the same thing. If you literally have nothing left, no family, no responsibilities that matter that much, a vengeful killing spree sounds pretty good.
I agree. If you have nothing left, but his interrogation was very clumsy. That's not how you would interrogate. If you were going in with the willingness to kill your suspect to get information, you're not going to go in and chat with him on the bed, right? That's not
True.
no.
You're going to
person would
extract
be,
him to a different site.
And I'm not going to give away the way he interrogates Saul Agnon, because now that Saul is on the list, we know he's on the list. You don't want to be on. God, great quote that's going to come later, by the way. That's how you would interrogate somebody.
Yep.
So, you know, I'm giving the screenwriter a pass that adapted the novel. But yeah, that's not how I would have done that interrogation. He got really lucky on that interaction. The character got very lucky, and maybe that was on purpose. The element of chance, the reader and the viewpoint character are both kind of twisting in the wind, so it effectively built tension. So I'm cool with that. And assuming you get a proper shot through the on-off switch, yes, a single round will do it. And Reese would have been trained to hit that on-off switch from any angle in the brain box so that he could do it reflexively. So that's also credible. Standard target. In fact, the only target you get when you're doing hostage rescue training and building muscle memory is a 305 card over the center of the head of the is it an F-type target, T-type target? I forget what it's called. But yeah, once you're in SCT or platoon workups, you don't shoot body with pistol or submachine guns. You're going for headshots.
Well, and because there are people you don't want to shoot
through plate carriers with pistol and submachine gun rounds. So
and in a hostage rescue situation, there are people you don't want to kill there.
Yeah, so it's his precision and economy of force being reflexive is credible, especially at contact distances, which he was.
Yeah, absolutely. So overall, I'm really happy with this episode at this point. I think it's nice to have Reese focused, aimed, and justified, so we can, as brutal as it gets, we're at least on his side throughout the rest of the story for the most part. Katie's got some character development, and we know who at least some of the bad guys are, and it starts to get a lot more exciting.
Yeah, the end of this episode is what kept me in for episode 3. Because frankly, up to this point, I'm like, oh God, are we going to have it? I haven't read the book. I'm not acquainted with the series that Jack Carr has successfully novelized and shared and done so well with. But I really wasn't down for a tortured special operations veteran story, right?
Yeah.
Where everything's ambiguous. I suffer from what might be a very American malady, which is I like my right and wrong, and I want to get to which one's which pretty rapidly so that we can get on with the justified headshots.
Yeah.
And
I like like, I think if I'm like maybe my thesis as a writer is how to hold on to your concept of right and wrong when shit is terrible or complicated, but it's never that there isn't a right or wrong. Like that's kind of where I am, that I'm like, I went through, I served during two wars that our country was clearly not trying to win. And it was very difficult because I was a true believer growing up. My dad served in Vietnam. I think yours did as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And he came out of Vietnam with his moral certainty still intact. So that was the man who, raised me. And it was a challenge to maintain belief in the face of all the cynicism of the 21st century, but I still do believe in right and wrong, and I still believe it is our responsibility to try to ascertain what is right, even when it's very complicated. Knowing we're going to get it wrong sometimes, it does not relieve us of the burden to attempt to do the right thing. And I agree with you that
I think this story does that, Justin.
exactly.
And this character, yes, he's going to be seeking revenge, but the reason that revenge exists often is because justice is not accessible.
Yep.
Right? Had the NCIS agent not been not just, frankly, he was aiding and abetting evil. He didn't,
Yeah.
as far as we know, we still don't know at that point whether or not he was the guy in the MRI room whose eyes are seen through the balaclava,
Well,
right?
we know he's not because or we at least think he's not because he doesn't have a knife wound.
Right.
That was
And
actually something we
that was an
missed.
important
That was a
point.
great beat. That
Yeah.
Reese pushes on despite not having that evidence. So,
well, and frankly, at that point, I'm like, Jesus, man, you're getting ready to hurt someone who's not the guy you were sure a second ago. The reason he goes in because he's sure he's going to find a knife wound on the forearm, right? And when there's not one, you're like, oh, dude, oh,
yeah, it's the closest thing.
It is important. It is vitally important when one is seeking justice or applying force that you have the right target. Because
Absolutely,
if that NCIS agent had actually been just an NCIS agent, that's the point at which Reese's character becomes irredeemable.
yeah, he's the bad guy now, pure and simple.
Back to your point of right and wrong, willfully killing innocents is one of the things that can make a damaged but otherwise justified character become irredeemable. Both in terms of real life and also in the way you write someone. There are ways that writers can signal good guy, bad guy, troubled person, redeemable, not redeemable. Are you familiar with the Brotherhood of War series by W.B. Griffin?
I have reread the Brotherhood of War series every year since I was 13.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you know the character of Lowell, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
And there's an argument that can be made, effective in the very last, not the last book, but chronologically, I think it's called The Generals, where Lowell makes a decision, which is in the sense of being a commissioned officer and upholding a code, is not redeemable. And
he does that twice, actually. He does it in the Colonels as well. Lowell does that. Lowell does that twice. He does that in the Colonels as well. If it's what I'm thinking of, he sleeps with the wife of a subordinate at one point, and he sleeps with in Germany before he goes to Algeria. He sleeps with the wife of a subordinate.
Oh, yeah.
And then he sleeps with the wife of a POW, and they try to justify it later by pointing out that the POW himself had been cheating on his wife before he was captured, so it's kind of okay. But the problem is, you've already lost us at that point.
That's
sorry.
right. That's right. So yeah, he sends the guy on a remain overnight, not with the intention of, but he gets liquored up, and Mrs. Remain Overnight shows up and says, "That's why I sent him away, right? So let's get to it." And he's like, "Oh, what the hell?"
Yeah.
And that's the point at which, yes, 100% right. So had the NCIS agent Holder, right?
Holder? Yes. Correct.
Had he not been guilty, frankly dirty, and therefore culpable, assaulting him, let alone murdering him, would have been irredeemable.
Correct.
So
I
that
agree.
that getting him to break, and frankly having the character visibly become less composed and lose his shit in the flashback, and that scaring the NCIS agent is credible. That's what it would take, because
Yeah.
NCIS agents are probably used to getting, they know they're not loved, right? So
Yeah.
unless he really thinks the guy's going to kill him, and there's nothing in Reese's background to suggest he's going to murder someone out of cold, in cold blood.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, he's not really himself. So it was that, and was that also in the book, in the novel?
No, it plays a lot differently in the novel.
Okay.
He has more information in the novel. He
Hmm.
basically does the tactical site exploitation of the guy's data, and then
Ah,
just kills him.
all right.
Like basically at that point, it's less dramatic. I like the way they did it in the series for the purpose of the series,
So
but
kudos to the screenwriters for making that change. That was
mm,
credible, especially given the time budget you have to work with with film time. Speaking of
yeah.
which, we're right about an hour, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. And that is probably a good time to wrap up. Mike, I know I had you say this on the last podcast, but go ahead and tell us again what's out now and what are you excited about coming in the near future for your writing career?
Thanks. The omnibus for Chuck Gannon's Kaneverse Lost Soldier series, in which I have a novella, is
Mhm.
available now. Just signed some contracts for 2 upcoming stories. One in Johnny Ringo's Black Tide Rising universe, a new anthology called We Shall Rise. Oh, sorry, no, correction. United We Stand.
Okay, gotcha. Because We Shall Rise was the last one, right?
Also available in booksellers near you.
Hmm.
Um, and signed a contract for an anthology that's going to be helmed by Larry Correia and Casey Azell in the Noir Fatale series. So lots of good stuff coming.
Nice, excellent. We'll have links to that below. I think this may come out after the Dragon Awards, so but maybe if it's not out after the Dragon Awards, there will also be a link to the Dragon Awards to nominate your
Yep.
favorite speculative fiction titles in basically all forms of media: game, TV series, movie, and book. That's all the time we have for the Lore and Valor podcast. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed our content, or leave us a 5-star review on your favorite audio platform. Hope to see you next time. And until then, let me find my mouse. Keep up the fire.